Oil had forever altered the complexion and lifestyle of East Texas. More than 1,000 operators had flooded the oil patch in the 9 months after Dad Joyner's discovery on Daisy Bradford's farm, the largest number ever recorded for any field at any time. During the week of October the 28th, 1931, oil men brought in 172 producing wells. And by the 1st of November, locations had been staked and drilling begun on 195 more wells. By the end of the year, the landscape was bristling with 3,600 oil wells, and the field was producing more than 1 million barrels a day.
You could see 200 or 300 oil wells standing here, and half of them in the early days would have been wood derricks.
I don't know how many derricks there were, but I'm going to estimate in the city limits there was probably 2,000, something like that. I don't know exactly where the city limits were at that time.
Noises with pumps going, and then they would have burners to burn off the excess gas. And at night, you could drive around and see these torches. And we didn't go to a lot of places because it was too busy.
Kilgore had grown thick with wooden derricks, cut from green lumber in the surrounding forests. As the wood began drying, nails and bolts were forced out of the joints, and the crippled derricks often collapsed under the stress and strain for pulling casing. Draped in oil and soaked with grease, the derricks were fire traps awaiting a spark.
Because they had wooden derricks at that time, they would get soaked with oil, and when they got fire, well, they went up immediately.
It didn't take long for them to be replaced by derricks of steel, all jammed together alongside downtown streets, between buildings, on both sides of the railroad tracks, through the floors of empty stores, alongside stunted cotton stalks, on farmsteads, and in back row barrow ditches, even in the cemetery. It was a forest of wood and metal stained black. In Kilgore, in 1931, black had replaced green as the color of money. Merchants tore off the backs of their stores, ripped up their wood floors, and began digging holes. The bank ultimately came down because the oil down below it was worth far more than the deposits in its vault. And before the decade ended, 24 wells would be drilled in one city block. It would be known as the world's richest acre.
So they started drilling wells all over town. About a year after they started tearing out Main Street, there used to be 3 or 4 stores on Main Street. The bank was on Main Street, Brown Drug was on Main Street. Some of the other areas, the Griffins had a place and the Dixons had a place, and they began to take them out one at a time and drill them on the other street.
And that's where the richest acre came in, where all those merchants along the front of the railroad track cut the buildings off and get 2 oil wells right where it stood.
The main street of Kilgore became the world's richest acre. There were 24 wells and no telling how many millions of dollars within that small space.
The Presbyterians decided that their sanctuary, built after the mysterious and disastrous fire of 1931, set on land as valuable as the rest of the dirt in Kilgore. If they happened to be right, then profits from oil might as well flow into their own collection plates on days other than Sundays. Unfortunately, the prospects of finding oil somewhere beneath the pulpit was much more daunting than they'd expected. They were told, "If we drill on your property, we'll have to take the front of the church building and cut it in half." That was unthinkable, some said, a measure far too drastic to even be considered. A vote was taken, and a day later, crews began cutting the church in half.
So they tore down half of the church, and that was a very funny sight to see.
Our Sunday school class was right here. They drilled a well right there out of our Sunday school class window.
Drilling lasted all day and thundered into the night. On Sunday morning, The noise was unbearable. The Reverend Cecil Lang couldn't preach in the solemn, reverent fashion to which he was accustomed.
The preacher on Sunday was having trouble having his parishioners hear his sermon, and he had to stop his sermon and go out and tell them to stop drilling.
Philip Barton, the clerk of session, quietly took Reverend Lang aside and whispered to him, "You go inside and tend to the preaching. We'll stay outside and tend to the drilling." Families clustered together beneath the pines of Happy Hollow, just east of downtown.
There was a deep valley that had a stream running through it, and lots of pine trees and that. And the people, now we'd call them homeless people. They were just people here trying to scramble out a living.
There was work, but there was no place to stay. People were sleeping in ditches. They would throw blankets over a fence line and sleep underneath at night.
But there was nowhere for them to go, so they built little hooches out of anything they could find, pieces of wood, tin, cardboard, and they were all down through there, about 4 acres of them.
My father and 2 other men put together a little house built out of cardboard, swabbed it down with wax, and that wax kept the rains out from underneath.
The nights were aglow with scattered embers of wayward campfires, keeping people warm when the chill of winter sagged down upon the ravines, keeping their food cooked when their tin cans still had the tracings of food left in them. The yards were full of destitute children, barefooted and wearing ragged clothes. They were so thin, eyes hollow, bellies empty, wondering where they were and why God had put them in such a place and forsaken them.
And it was going just fine until the night that it caught fire. And nothing burns like wax, paraffin, and cardboard boxes. And he spent the rest of his life with a huge burn scar on his left arm. And I once asked him, I said, "Did that make you want to leave?" He said, "No, it just made me want to work long enough that I could buy a house and not worry about a paraffin house anymore."
Kilgore was an exciting place to be in the 1930s. All kinds of entertainment.
We had plenty of places for entertainment, and there was around 8 beer joints, as we called them, that were all located right in there. Most all of them had a jukebox with small dance floors, and there was a lot of dancing going on in Kilgore at that time.
A New Orleans newspaper wrote of Kilgore in 1931. There were many in Kilgore, both honky-tonks and lost loves.
You had nightclubs of all varieties and kinds. You had what they called the pajama girls. With Boomtowns, you had all kinds of vices.
For a time, there was no law and very little order. Hustlers hustled, robbers robbed, and bullets caused as many health problems and put more in the burying ground than either derrick fires, boiler explosions, or the weather. There were as many undesirables as roustabouts, and most could not tell the difference between them. Often, there was no difference at all. The stranger was a hard man with lethal eyes, a drifter who rode out of the night and into Kilgore, floating aimlessly from the threats of Pistol Hill to the promises of Newton Flats. He kept to himself, seldom spoke, and became a friend to no one. His clothes were stained with dirt and oil, hanging loose on his gaunt frame. His face was stern, and his whiskers were 2 weeks from their last shave. He was obviously a bum, out of work and down on his luck. The hard man with lethal eyes watched men parted from their money, never forgetting the faces of those who took it. He left everyone alone. His was merely the newest shadow in town. After a few weeks, he had seen what he came to see, knew what he needed to know, and collected the names, real, assumed, or imagined, of those who didn't belong in any corner of a civilized society, not even in a boomtown. Late one night, the man washed the dirt from his face and gave himself a clean shave. He threw his filthy, ragged clothes out back and burned them. He placed a white Stetson on his head and strapped 2 pearl-handled, silver-mounted revolvers around his hips. He rode back into Kilgore at sunrise astride his trusted horse he called Tony, wearing the badge of a Texas Ranger. Malcolm Krim introduced him as Lone Wolf Gonzalez. When Krim was elected mayor, he had sworn to rid Kilgore of the crime and violence that an oil boom had brought to the town streets. Lone Wolf Gonzalez was his hired gun.
Town was lawless. Texas Rangers had to come in. We didn't have any police. We had constables, but it was really rough in the early days.
He had a reputation that was ahead of him.
I've seen as many as 50 people chained to the post up there because they didn't have any place to put them.
He didn't need any help most of the time. He could handle pretty well anything that came up.
Lone Wolf Gonzalez had gained fame years earlier when he broke up a riot. And all of a sudden, he came in to face this rioting crowd, and somebody looked at him and said, "Did they just send one ranger?"
As the old saying goes, one riot, one ranger. And he backed that up, I understand, very well.
Lone Wolf Gonzalez said in his opening statement, "Crime may expect no quarter in Kilgore. Gambling houses, slot machines, whiskey rings, and dope peddlers might as well save the trouble of opening up because they will not be tolerated. Drifters and transients have their choice of 3 things: engaging in a legitimate business, getting out of town, or going to jail."
Now Lone Wolf Gonzalez was walking the streets of Kilgore.
South Kilgore caught fire right after the boom started. On the side of the street, the electrical wires started burning. They started burning across the street where the prostitute houses were located. We got up there just in time to see Gonzalez pull up on his horse. He crawled down out of that horse, walked around the horse, took the bridle in his left hand, pulled a gun, and shot those wires in two that was burning across the street. We sat there and watched him do that.
He brought his own special brand of law and justice to Boomtown, Texas. He stopped strangers and meticulously examined the palms of their hands. If they were calloused, rough, and stained with dirt and grease, the ranger merely nodded and moved on. But if their hands were smooth and clean, bearing no traces, no scars of hard work, he jailed the stranger with or without just cause.
Hands that had never been doing hard labor, they would send him out. They wouldn't let him stay.
Lone Wolf knew the stranger was already guilty of something, or would be soon. On the night of March 2nd, 1931, the law in Kilgore struck with force. Lone Wolf Gonzalez and his partner Bob Goss quietly brought a few lawmen they could trust into town, and, shrouded by a blanket of darkness, they raided every honky-tonk, beer joint, pool hall, dance hall, domino parlor, gambling den, and dive that camouflaged its vice and crime behind a charade of glitter and music.
But Bob Goss was hired by Gonzalez to help enforce this law in East Texas.
Bob Goss used to go down here to a place called Johnson's Barber Shop on Russ Street, and he'd get a shave every day. And he'd get in the chair farthest from the door, and get the guy to turn the chair facing the door. And he wouldn't let him lay him all the way back because he wanted to be able to see. And they pull that striped big sheet of a thing, a towel they used to pull over you in the barbershop. And he had his gun pulled and laying on top of his leg under the sheet, pointing at the door. So he would never turn his back on the door, including even getting a shave.
He was later the police chief of Kilgore, and there is a interesting story, apocryphal or not, that the bank in Kilgore was robbed by two armed men, and they started fleeing across the railroad tracks, and Bob Goss shot both of them, killed both of the bandits. People were there complimenting him on his quick reaction to the bank being robbed. And Bob Goss said, well, I didn't know that the bank had been robbed. I saw those two guys in Kilgore yesterday, and I knew they were up to no good, and I told them if I saw them the next day, I was going to kill them. I saw them, I killed them.
Lone Wolf Gonzalez and Bob Goss and the Kilgore policemen were in charge of one of the largest raids that ever happened in the state of Texas. There was a little clearing out in the forest that was known as Kilgore's Monte Carlo, where all the illegal whiskey, all the illegal gambling took place. And in the dark of night, they raided the place. Lone Wolf Gonzalez later said, people were scampering out of the trees. They were coming out. It looked like a stampede of mad cattle. They arrested 520 people.
The raid thundered down into the ravine as veal, beef, pork, and fish were being barbecued in a long pit. The men were relieved of their knives, straight-edged razors, and a few handguns. When the sun rose the next morning, Main Street was packed with more than 500 prisoners, and there was no jail big enough or stout enough to hold them all. Gonzalez went down to the hardware store and secured a chain a block long. He put about 100 trace chains on it, placed padlocks on the trace chains, and used it for his jail. The Rangers knew all about crime and punishment. They herded the prisoners to a wooded corner of town and hooked them up to a makeshift homemade trot line, log chains wrapped around the pines and locked in place. The ne'er-do-wells sat or slept on the ground. Whether the sun baked their hides or the rains drummed their heads, it didn't matter to the Rangers. The cane-bottomed chairs were ripped out of a deserted Baptist church, and the log chain trot line was dragged from the pines into the sweltering sanctuary of the little wooden building.
That they had chains through the pews at the church, and they put the prisoners in the pews and chained them all in a line.
There were no jails, and the Baptist church was used as a jail until they filled it up. And Gonzalez, he just ran a logging chain between two trees in the yard of the church, and they just started handcuffing people to the chain.
The same oil that had brought relief to East Texas now damned the land and the men who drilled for its riches. The nation was still overcast with the dark clouds of the Great Depression, and those intolerable economic times had triggered a serious decline in the demand for petroleum products.
There were so many oil wells being drilled, so much oil being produced, that suddenly the whole country found itself restricted by the law of supply and demand.
Huge amounts of oil were stored in tanks above ground, but no one wanted the oil. There was no reason to buy it when there was no way to sell it. The market had become glutted, and now cheap East Texas crude was driving the price down and driving many operators to the brink of ruin. Oil was selling for $1.10 a barrel on that October night when Dad Joyner hit pay dirt at the Daisy Bradford No. 3. By Christmas, tank cars were moving out with oil valued at 60 cents a barrel. Before the year ended, the price had dropped as low as 15 cents a barrel, then even lower, reaching the bottom of the barrel and stagnating. Oil men believed they were wealthy, but they could barely make payroll. There was, they decided, only one way to overcome the financial woes created by cheaper oil: drill more wells, pump more oil, and the East Texas oil field began producing 500,000 barrels a day.
In the early days, they produced so much oil they couldn't sell it. I've seen the oil sell for less than 10 cents a barrel. Now, I mean, you can buy Coke for a dime, or used to. Less than a dime, you could buy a barrel of oil.
By the time 1931 came to an end, a total of 3,601 wells had been drilled across 114,000 acres, and the price of oil was in a downward spiral, skidding to 6 cents and sometimes even 2 cents a barrel. Kilgore found itself mired in a monetary quagmire where it took 3 barrels of oil to buy a bottle of beer. If a well cost $12,000 to drill, it would be necessary to produce as many as 200,000 barrels just to break even. The more oil a man squeezed from the innards of the earth, the cheaper he sold it, and the poorer he became. As the financial situation worsened in the oil fields around Kilgore, the Texas Railroad Commission realized that a lid had to be put on a problem spinning wildly out of control as quickly and tightly as possible. The TRC issued an order limiting the field to a mere 160,000 barrels a day, even though Governor Ross Sterling did not believe for a minute that oil producers would obey the decree. He settled down for a long, grueling battle that he thought would probably be fought in the courts.
The Railroad Commission, which had been given the authority to control the field and make the rules for how the field was to be produced, proration was one of the most controversial subjects. There had never been an oil field in America quite like the East Texas field.
Every time you drill a well, they had an allowable, we had so much oil that they say you could produce so much oil from a well.
It was so prolific that it could make 1 million barrels a day and then some. And the price of oil fell to 10 cents a barrel.
And they had to close them until after they produced that, they had to shut them down.
The state passed proration laws, which meant that wells in the East Texas field could only produce so much oil a day. And of course, that people that had invested in wells and had drilled wells and borrowed money, they did not like that. They believed the oil belonged to them. They wanted to capture it, and they wanted to sell it.
He was confronting a rare breed of strong-willed and stubborn men who were old hands at facing adversity. Drill bits stuck in the rock, searching for oil without a dollar to their name, gambling that the junk pipe would last until the earth was stained with black gold, wondering where the next meal was coming from or if there would be a next meal. Now, those were problems. To hell with the governor. They found oil, drilled with more guts than guile, and their cups were running over with crude. Ross Sterling could not take it away from them. Many were ready for a good fight. As Tom G. Patton would bitterly tell the governor, "It's my oil, and if I want to drink it, that's none of your damned business." Oilmen had drawn a line in the dirt, and they were willing to fire the first shot. The order issued by the Texas Railroad Commission had been defied, ignored, and scorned. Governor Ross Sterling took it personally. He called a special session of the legislature to put teeth in the order and declared martial law against, he said, an entrenched group of insurrectionists guilty of reckless, unlawful, and criminal handling of producing wells. Troops were dispatched to the oil fields around Kilgore, and all of East Texas waited for the invasion. As the New York Times reported, hundreds of undesirable men and women quickly packed their belongings and are fleeing from the oil field towns.
I guess there were a lot of disagreements in how things were going during the oil boom, and they had to call martial law.
They brought in the National Guards. And the National Guard moved up on the hill where the football field is located now. All that was National Guard area.
Of course, everybody was overproducing, and governor finally said that something had to be done, and he sent in the National Guard to more or less shut the oil field down and have a plan and regulations on what you can produce daily and how you can move the oil, and just for the environment's sake.
By the middle of August, 99 officers and 1,104 enlisted men of the Texas National Guard, commanded by Brigadier General Jacob Wolters, were encamped near the Lou Della No. 1 well, patrolling all dirt roads that led to wells scattered across 600 square miles of the embittered oil field. Their bivouac area would become known as Proration Hill. The military had arrived with infantry, cavalry, and 2 antiquated World War I aircraft, with the general setting up his headquarters in Kilgore City Hall. General Wolters dispatched his first warning. All wells would be shut down by noon on August 17th, or the National Guardsmen would shut them down. He mounted the steps of Kilgore City Hall and read the governor's proclamation. Martial law had been declared, he said, because the oil field was in a state of insurrection against the conservation laws of the state and in open rebellion against the constituted civil authorities in Texas. The crowd listened, and when the general finished, they broke out in laughter and ambled on back home. By September, the fields were at last reopened with an allowable of 28 barrels per well, and about a third of the troops marched out of the oil fields and toward home. Within 3 months, the price of oil dramatically rose from a dime to 83 cents a barrel. The allowable was working. So was greed. Little tea kettle refineries, hidden in barns, houses, and thick forest hollows, could produce 16 to 18 gallons of gasoline from a barrel of crude, and the bootleg oil was being hauled out of East Texas at an alarming rate. When the refineries were shut down, operators loaded their hot oil on trucks and shipped it out through the woods at night.
Where there's a will, there's a way. And if you're in the oil business during the day, you know where everything is, you know how the pipelines work.
There were a bunch of what they called Jake leg refineries that popped up around the country. There's one over in Overton in that day, and there's some across the Oklahoma line. And they would let you run in truckloads of oil, no questions asked, and refine it, you know, probably on a cut.
They had pipelines with right-hand valves on them to where they were open when they looked like they were closed.
Some scam artists took oil from their original wells and poured it into 3 or 4 shallow dummy ones they had drilled. With more crude to sell, they greatly increased their allowance, even though their profits had dropped, and they were earning next to nothing with their scheme.
These guys would go out there with these tank trucks, because oil tanks periodically have to be cleaned out. They get paraffin and stuff in the bottom of them that the guys that ran the business called them BS, because that's what it looked like in the bottom of the tanks.
In World War II, gasoline was rationed. People didn't have but one car back in those days. And the kids would go out into the oil field and find somehow to get gasoline. I don't know how, and put it in their cars.
They would run oil in there, what they call fresh oil, run in there to cut it like a solvent and pump that out of there. And normally it didn't take all that much. What these guys would do is go out there and start the job late in the day and pump all the BS out, and then they'd just sit there and keep running fresh oil and pumping it into their trucks.
Almost overnight, the price began slipping again. Guardsmen were seen wandering out among the wells as often as oil operators, using metal detectors to locate illegal pipelines that, in time, would smuggle more than 100 million barrels out of the field.
I think with the oil theft, there were just so many people doing it.
It's very, very common. It was, in fact, it was coffee shop talk that was going on.
And I think a lot of them were pretty well connected to where I don't think many were ever punished.
If you had a little grocery store and somebody came in and got a loaf of bread and took it out the door, you didn't do anything. And that went on for about 15 years. And then one day that guy walks in, or lady, and picks up that loaf of bread, and you shoot him with a pistol. It wasn't anything unknown. In fact, some of the pipes, many will tell you, were on top of the ground.
By 1932, oil producers had grown tired of sitting still while illegal operators cheated and stole and kept the price of oil beat down. They had trusted the law while others ignored it, and now they were fighting back. 1,500 of them, angry and frustrated, grimly voted to form a vigilante committee. If legal means could not put an end to hot oil, they would. And undertakers just might wind up the richest men in town. Kilgore hardware dealers sold out of buckshot and shells, and during the next 2 months, 4 bootleg oil pipelines were blasted out of the earth with dynamite.
It probably lasted longer than we know it did, but when it was over, it stopped pretty quick.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt was aware he had to do something. By 1933, the price of oil in East Texas had plunged to 4 cents a barrel, and Roosevelt personally joined the war. He banned hot oil from interstate commerce, and federal agents sternly made their way into Kilgore. They had the power and the money to enforce whatever rules, regulations, or laws the president wanted. You can produce hot oil, Washington said, but you can't take it out of Texas. You may have to drink it. There's certainly no market for it inside the state.
So the fight continued for days, for weeks, for months, for a year, and finally, Texas Senator Tom Connally decided something had to be done once and for all because he was tired of seeing the military march up and down the streets of Kilgore as though it were an occupied territory.
Widespread fraud continued to snake its way through the oil patch, but hot oil shipments shrank from 100,000 barrels to fewer than 10,000 barrels a day by the end of 1934. Senator Tom Connally called J. Howard Marshall in charge of the federal legal effort in East Texas. "Can you write a law that's constitutional and will stop this hot oil racket?" he asked. Within 2 days, J. Howard Marshall had drafted the language that would give strength to the Connally Hot Oil Act, and it was signed into law. An old attorney met with the oil bootleggers who had been his clients and said solemnly, "Men, you've had a good run for your money. Now it's time to get off the gravy train." Within a year, hot oil was barely a drip in the fields around Texas, and the price of crude crept upward until it reached $1 a barrel again. The battle over hot oil erupted in flames on a tragic Sunday. Only 15 minutes after the last prayer, the ragged tongue of a roaring flame broke through the roof of the First Presbyterian Church. Men from the Methodist Church ran madly down the block, joining oilfield workers who had tumbled out of their tar paper shacks to battle the raging blaze. The Presbyterian Church was already in ashes when flames began ravaging the sanctuary of the First Methodist Church as well. Before the day came to an end, the First Baptist Church also exploded and burned, and Kilgore, with grief and sadness, became known as the town without a church. As the years passed, religion took a strong stand in the life of Kilgore. A new Christ the King Catholic Church took its place alongside the First Presbyterian Church, First Baptist Church, St. Luke's Methodist Church, the Christian Church Tabernacle, the Church of Christ, and the Beth Shalom Jewish Synagogue. They, along with St. Paul's Episcopal Church, all became an integral part of the town's vibrant religious heritage. A year after the Daisy Bradford No. 3 forever altered the face of East Texas with oil, the Longview Daily News declared that the field was gigantic beside Cushing in her greatest days, shaming Seminole at the climax of her mad boom, bigger by far than Burke Burnett, and relegating Ranger to the category of small fry. The newspaper reported over 2,200 gushers have come in to spout geysers of black gold heavenward in their initial burst from the bosom of Mother Earth. And from that subterranean treasure chest, the year has seen 73 million barrels of high-gravity sweet crude oil, the best the world ever knew, extracted. Today, the oil world as a whole calmly admits without question or comparison that the East Texas oil field is the largest ever known both in area and production. A hamlet, a town, then a city was growing up on land steeped with oil. A few months after the boom rocked the foundation of East Texas, Kilgore had 78 cafes, 29 supply houses, 21 filling stations, 17 meat markets, 16 general merchandise stores, 15 barbershops, 14 lumber companies, 14 hotels, 13 real estate offices, 10 doctors, 9 furniture stores, 8 garages, 8 drugstores, 7 welding shops, 5 hardware companies, 4 electrical shops, 4 dry goods stores, 3 tank companies, 3 laundries, and a newspaper, which began as a semi-weekly and was quickly changed to a daily.
In other words, we had real streets. If you notice, all the neighborhoods had sidewalks. Everything was pretty well cleaned up.
For $7.50 a week, give or take a handful of dimes and a few scattered nickels, the Maine, Como, Alvin, Hurd, and Passmore hotels offered 8 hours of sleep at night and 3 meals a day. The oil supply houses lined the railroad tracks along Commerce Street, and it was said of Supply Row, if it doesn't have it, you don't need it, and probably weren't going to pay for it anyway.
We were on Commerce. The Commerce was just one right after the other, all the way to the other end, and everybody knew what everybody else had. So if they came into our store and they needed something else, Daddy could tell them where they could go get it. Our business was open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day until really after World War II.
Before the decade ended, the town would have more oil wells than people, and rumors persisted that Kilgore had become the richest city per capita in the world. No one ever proved it. They just passed the information along as though it were gospel, and maybe it was. The visionaries reasoned that there could be no rise of civilization in a field of mud without a field of dreams. To Kilgore in 1931 came baseball, genuine professional hardball baseball. The East Texas League was founded in Mayor Malcolm Crimm's office with 6 towns in the area buying franchises for the cost of $100 each to Class D minor league teams. An arbitrary salary cap was imposed, charging that no team would be afforded the luxury of spending more than $2,000 a month. Crimm, who co-owned the Kilgore Gushers, drew up plans for a new $10,000 baseball park. By late April, the Kilgore Daily News was editorializing about opening day, saying, "Every business store in town should close its doors in order that employee and employer will have a chance to lend his presence and support to the Gushers." But alas, the game on opening day would have to be played someplace other than the new park. The field had not been completed in time because oil men, who only thought they were sportsmen, were more concerned about drilling oil wells between the dugouts than watching a game, which could wait until the pump jacks were working as hard as proration would allow them. So the Kilgore Gushers and the Longview Cannibals packed up their gloves and bats and headed on down to the old rundown ballpark perched alongside the Gladewater Highway. Play ball! Nobody could. The rains came and washed the game out. A doubleheader was finally played in Longview, and the Gushers lost 3 consecutive times before recording their first win, 9-5, over Tyler on May the 5th. It would be their only victory and their final game of the season. 3 days later, the East Texas League, plagued by financial problems and hampered by low attendance and bad weather, solemnly and sadly disbanded and went out of business. It may have been the only time in organized sports when an entire season was rained out. Music throbbed across the dimly lit dance floors of Mattie's ballroom. Mattie Castleberry was familiar with the rough and tattered edges of a rough-hewn town. She had worked in a Tulsa card and cigar store in 1916, making the rounds when oil splashed across the wild, inebriated eyes of Seminole and Borger, Pampa and Burke Burnett. Mattie Castleberry and the oil booms seemed meant for each other. She opened her ballroom in Kilgore, and a band struck up its music for the first time on April 22, 1931, while oil was still bubbling hot out on the farms of Daisy Bradford and Lou Della Crim. Mattie's name would become familiar with a whole generation of boomers who weren't quite sure who either Daisy or Lou Della really were. Her dancing establishment wasn't really much of a place, not much more than a glorified shack stuck back amidst the pines and underbrush. But Mattie draped yellow and blue cloth from the ceiling, and she hung a revolving ball covered with small copper mirrors to reflect the spotlight and ricochet razored splinters of glitter across the dance floor. Perhaps it was just a shack in the harsh realities of daylight, but at night, it was a mecca of magic.
Mattie Castleberry and Mattie's Ballroom was the first real hint of fine culture. Once she realized there were a lot of single men in Kilgore. She realized there were a lot of lonely men in Kilgore. She realized there were a lot of lonesome women in this part of the world.
She hired girls, as many as 20, sometimes 40 at a time, to stand in line at the front of the hall. Men without partners merely bought tickets for a dime apiece, walked up to any girl still in line, and danced with her until the music wound down. And it always wound down before the dancers did. The faces of the taxi dancers changed almost as often as the bands. New girls were always looking for a job, and others were trading the last dance for a wedding ring. It was not unusual for a man to walk into Mattie's at night and have a wife or the promise of one by early morning. Mattie was an astute businesswoman, hard-minded and practical. She always wore fabulous evening gowns, sitting at the door, selling tickets and collecting money. That's what she did best. Collect the money.
And they were called taxi dancers because you could dance with the girls, but you couldn't leave with them. They had to come and go in a taxi. Mattie wanted everybody to know that Mattie's Ballroom was on the up and up.
Mattie ran a clean operation.
Taxi dances cost a dime, with the girl earning 1 nickel and Mattie banking the other. A lot of dances, a lot of dimes.
Mattie had about 15 or 20 of the biggest bands in the nation came to her place and played.
Bringing in such musicians as Guy Lombardo, Harry James, Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, Cab Calloway, Benny Goodman, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Paul Whiteman, Wayne King, and of course, Herb Cook and his all-girl band. When Bob Wills rode in with a fiddle that could wring broken-hearted teardrops out of the most calloused men in town, people would begin crowding through Mattie's front door long before sundown. Music couldn't heal the scars from a long day in the oil field, but for the night, music and a dime or two could certainly ease the pain.
It was one of the lively places of the East Texas boom. And, that's been 80 years ago, and the legend of Mattie lives on.
During the spring of 1935, the superintendent of public schools, W.L. Dodson, began a virtual one-man campaign to establish a junior college in Kilgore. He reasoned that oil made growth possible. Now, education would be the catalyst for its future. The residents of Kilgore passed the creation of the college with a vote of 176 to 1. Thus began one of the oldest, most respected, and most progressive junior colleges in Texas. Dodson took the reins as president, and Dr. B.E. Masters became dean. The campus was smaller than a city block and had no buildings. 12 faculty members were hired and handed the task of teaching 850 students at the high school, in churches, and even in a few assorted private homes. By the next year, a new administration building had been built. Dean B.E. Masters was a troubled man. Kilgore College had a football team, and a pretty good one too, he thought. After all, Coach Clyde Lee had left Overton High School to take the helm of the Rangers, and he immediately established a winning tradition. The college won 5, lost 3, and tied 2 during their first season, then promptly won the Texas State Championship a year later with a 10-1 record. The Rangers collected 17 victories while losing only 3 times, with a single tie during the next 2 campaigns, ending the 1939 season undefeated and untied, once again capturing the Texas State Championship and bringing it home to Kilgore. But Masters still had a reason to be concerned. He felt that too many fans left the stands during halftime, during a lull in the action, and went back home.
Dean Masters, who was running the college, wanted something to keep the fans in the stands during halftime. A lot of the people who attended the games had flasks in their back pockets, and they would go under the stands and have a drink or two.
In addition, he realized that the college had an average of 6 boys to every girl who attended classes. Dr. Masters decided he could solve both issues with a single idea. Masters had become intrigued with the color, pageantry, and precision of the Flaming Flashes, an all-girl drill team at Greenville High School. Maybe Kilgore College could create some kind of drill team to perform at halftime with H.L. Major Walker's Ranger Band. He moved quickly, hiring Gussie Nell Davis away from her teaching and drill team duties at Greenville, persuading her to invent, devise, and develop a marching unit that would add color and excitement to Kilgore College football games. Relying on her years of instruction in ballet, jazz, and tap dancing, Gussie Nell Davis created the Rangerettes, selecting girls for their beauty, grace, coordination, sense of rhythm, and dedication to hard work, especially hard work.
The first girls drill team, I think, in the United States. And the Rangerettes have gone on to become world famous.
One very nice lady to teach us all of this, and she taught us to smile, be positive about things, and do these things in business. She said when you go in to try out for a position in the company, be sure you stand up straight, smile, and be positive about it.
She was a good worker as far as raising money towards getting them for the uniforms and getting the trips to the different places they went, because the school couldn't afford it.
The Rangerettes took the nation by storm, performing at the presidential inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower and at Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City. Their high kick became famous worldwide as the Rangerettes took their own energetic style of dancing and entertainment to Japan, Hong Kong, Macau, Korea, and Venezuela. Television broadcaster Red Grange dubbed them Sweethearts of the Gridiron, and a Chicago Tribune writer labeled the Rangerettes as the gals with the misbehaving shoulders.
Very interesting to me, not the Rangerettes here, but watching them, but that they were able to go to New York City and other places. I thought it's very fascinating that little Kilgore, Texas was sending people to go to parades and to do things, and that was just a very big interest to me.
We found out we were going to the little Rose Bowl game, which we played in the Rose Bowl. We took the train. The Rangerettes and people from the city got on the train here in Kilgore and rode to California, to Pasadena. That was a big event for us.
Gussie Nell Davis drilled her girls for long, grueling hours on the football field. They became bundles of aches, energy, sweat, and nerves, but she always told them, beauty knows no pain. Her rangerettes had their share of both pain and beauty. As she watched her girls leave Kilgore College each year, she knew they're going to forget the routines, but they won't forget how to stand, how to be gracious, how to be good citizens. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think these are the things that matter.
I did not watch football. I watched the Rangerettes. I married one.
It was a great asset for me by telling the companies that I had been a rangerette.
As Kilgore braced itself for Christmas, Leggett Krim decided to brighten the landscape of his hometown and decorate the front of his hotel with Christmas lights. His old friend and lighting expert Knox Lamb dropped strings of lights down each of the hotel's 5 outside panels, topping them off with 8-foot stars built by the Sam Brown Lumber Yard for $28 apiece. Downtown glistened.
Christmas, you could go outside of town and get on a little hill and see hundreds of those lighted derricks with the stars.
It was different. No other city around had it, number one. And we had a lot of people that would drive from Dallas and come down here and from Shreveport just to look at the lights.
But it was not enough. Knox Lamb spent the next 5 days wiring more than 1,500 lights along each beam and crossbar of Leggett Krim's derricks down by the depot. One by one, merchants throughout the town began adding lights to their own stores along North Kilgore and North Streets. As the years rolled by, the merchants kept putting a few dollars aside, and when Christmas neared, they used them to buy more lights, putting more stars atop the derricks.
It was quite an attraction, and everybody, look, Christmas parade here, they crammed the streets. Businesses were open till 10, 11, 12 o'clock. It was an event.
During the holidays, Kilgore settled down amidst a spectacular maze of lights with more than 15,000 feet of wiring and 8,000 bulbs aglow throughout the downtown night. It was enough to take your breath away.
It's gorgeous. And the lights, I mean, they're so impressive. Then the outlining the derricks in those lights is beautiful.
Even as Kilgore fought to bring a measure of civilization to its Boomtown stature, the community remained at the mercy of oil, its riches, and its perils. In 1938, the Overton Refining Company struck a new well in the very heart of town, directly across the street from Kilgore's City Hall. In 25 minutes, the number 3 Nettie crane had flowed 25 barrels of oil. At 1:30 p.m., it blew out. A black 150-foot pillar of oil turned almost immediately into a red 150-foot pillar of flame that within an hour ate $50,000 worth of damage in the neighboring buildings. While firemen fought to save 5 other wells nearby, townspeople flocked to watch Kilgore's 3rd major oil fire in 6 years. But this time Kilgore was lucky. Next day, the fire was out. The fire became a virulent inferno, blazing unchecked for almost 12 hours, raging through the afternoon and into the night, stalking through 5 surrounding buildings. The derrick collapsed early, keeping firemen away from the well with a wall of hot, crumpled metal. Smoke and flames painted a dirty, gray sky at sundown, and fire crews from Kilgore, Tyler, Longview, Gladewater, Henderson, and Arp cautiously encircled the blaze. Crews feared that the hospital might burn.
They had an oil well fire across from City Hall, next door to the old Crane Hospital, and it was burning out of control. They sent in fire people from Shreveport and a lot of the larger cities to try to put it out. They were unsuccessful. So finally, Kilgore fire people told them to go home, they'd take care of it. And my understanding was that they sent in 2 firemen behind some metal shields with plenty of water soaking them. They went in and shut it off.
There were many oil fires around Kilgore, and today you have people like Boots and Coots, and you used to have Red Adair, the oil firefighters that you would have to call. But back in those days, they really didn't need them. The Kilgore Fire Department did it themselves. They were well equipped. They knew exactly how to fight an oil fire, which is very difficult when you've got a fire under pressure. But the Kilgore Fire Department, they did it. They put the fires out.
Fire had always been and would always be the scourge of the oil field. So much oil and grease had spilled and collected on Krim Avenue that it became the only street in Texas to ever burn. An oil well fire on the N.B. Elder Place near Shell Camp raged for 30 days before the last flame faded away. "Are you going to build the house back?" Elder was asked. "No," he replied. "I'm going to drill oil where it stood." A pipeline broke on the Atlas Oil Company lease 4 miles from town, and 4 people lay dead in its ashes. The next day, 3 oil workers perished when a battery of 6 1,000-barrel oil tanks caught fire at the Upchurch and Allen No. 2 Brightwell well. Less than a week later, a fire blazed through the vacant floor of the 3-story LaSalle Hotel during the hours just before dawn. Flames quickly engulfed the oil Boomtown frame structure, which once thrived as a lodging place for oilfield workers and Kilgore College football players. The flames endangered half a dozen wells, City Hall, and 2 lives. Fire trucks from Longview and Gladewater raced towards Kilgore, and many admitted among themselves they had just witnessed the most spectacular downtown fire since the old Hotel Kilgore burned down back in the early days of the boom. A landmark fell in 1942 when fire raged through the innards of the Texan Theater. It had known laughter and tears, fear and violence, but only on the screen. A decade of memories lay in a pile of twisted metal and ashes. But the end was not the end. The Texan would be built again, and cowboys would ride once more on the silver screen that adored land blackened by the heat of an ill-fated blaze. It was a night to remember. On June 21, 1939, more than 3,000 people crowded together along the sidewalks of South Kilgore Street to witness the grand opening of the new Krim Theater. A dance band struck up the music. The first ticket to the movie, Only Angels Have Wings, starring Cary Grant and Jean Arthur, was only valued at 40 cents. But it was auctioned for $613, bought by Mrs. John N. Peterson for her husband, who had not been able to accompany her to the premiere. Proceeds from the auction were given to the Milk Fund for needy children. Krim's goal was to build the finest theater in East Texas. It was designed in the streamlined Art Deco style, and he referred to his movie house as a modern classic building. It wasn't hype. The theater featured revolutionary pushback seats. A brilliantly colored carpet had been specially designed to harmonize with the color scheme of the interior. And the movie house was outfitted with the best possible low-frequency multicellular sound system with a provision for a public address system for the hard of hearing.
That was the plushest theater in East Texas, I guess, at that time.
On opening night, Leggett Krim hosted a barbecue at Meadowbrook Country Club for 200 guests. Of course, it was said of Leggett Krim he would loan you $10,000 to throw a party as long as he was invited. Kilgore always had a fascination for the movies, and its master showman knew how to attract a crowd. For the East Texas premiere of Gone with the Wind, Leggett Krim draped the marquee of his Krim Theater with Spanish moss, and actors dressed as Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara brought a touch of Margaret Mitchell's Southern charm and mystery to the streets outside. Entrepreneurs did not leave a piece of ground untouched. John Rather Sr. and his brother Bert had followed the booms from Borger to Burke Burnett to Kilgore. It was their Overton Oil Refining Company that struck a new well in the heart of downtown, then watched it blow out with a pillar of flame that could have easily burned down a town. John Sr. and Bert Rather struck it rich when they leased land and drilled wells along both sides of the railroad tracks. John Rather's son Jack bought the rights to such television shows as Lassie and The Lone Ranger, then produced a motion picture about his hometown, Strike It Rich, starring Rod Cameron, Stu Irwin, and Bonita Granville. With some of its critical scenes shot in and around Kilgore, the film traced the feuds and battles of proration during the early 1930s.
Leggett Krim, one of the sons of Ludella Krim, was very active in the movie business and is responsible for building two of the great iconic places in Kilgore, the Krim and the Texan, whose facades still grace the downtown area.
Across the street, the Texan Theater left behind a legacy of sidewalk hieroglyphics. Sketched in the cement were autographs of such Western movie screen heroes as Tex Ritter and Tom Mix.
One of the things that they did was bring stars here, cowboys, to the theater. And you could get Hopalong Cassidy would sign your piece of paper or whatever it was.
Their horses weren't forgotten or neglected either. Horseshoes and hoof prints indented the concrete sidewalk right alongside the cowboys' names.
The kids love to go up there. I used to go up on Saturday morning and walk up there, and they'd had a double-header Western with a bunch of cartoons and a couple of serials in between.
The most fun that my brother and I had was, and it helped gave my mother, because we had two other siblings, is give us a break. She would bring us to the Texas Theater, Texan, give us a quarter apiece. She'd find out when, what were the serials, they call them, going, and then what features, or through Red Rider, or whatever, and then we'd be there the afternoon. So from lunch till 4 o'clock, or even 4:30, she had freedom.
Movies were 9 cents, and soft drinks and popcorn a nickel each. For a pair of dimes, you could lose yourself in some faraway and exotic locale beyond the silver screen. Eat well, drink well, and go home with a penny in your pocket. It was the best of times that few thought would ever end. The earth beneath Kilgore in 1939 pulsed with oil. More than 60 gathering systems connected flowing and pumping wells in East Texas, moving the black gold to refineries, storage tanks, and waiting ships down on the coast. As the Kilgore Chamber of Commerce reported, these huge trunk lines spread like arteries throughout the entire state, each throbbing with the economic lifeblood of the nation and the world. The Austin Statesman wrote of Kilgore, "Derricks bristle all over town like quills on a porcupine's back. Group 500 wells within the confines of a small city, and you have something like a hairbrush with little stores and homes wedged in between the bristles." It was a sight to behold, a far cry from scattered farmsteads that once clung so precariously to the western edge of the civilized world in East Texas. Through decades of defiance and detraction, despair and destiny, families had fought to get through one day only to awaken and realize they now had to fight through another. For them, tomorrow had never been, nor never would be, just another day. Kilgore's sometimes quiet, sometimes raucous, often vitriolic past was a time when men gambled and won even when they couldn't afford the bet. Fortunes had been earned overnight and lost just as quickly. Oil had given life to some and taken it away from others. But they were all there when it happened. Without them, it might not have happened at all. The discovery of a great oil field had merely been an accomplishment, partly good fortune and mostly hard work. God had granted them the land. The rest was up to them. And building a great city among the thick forests of pines and derricks would be their destiny. The years had taken them away, but not their legacy. The inheritance of oil began with them, but did not end with them. It lasts from generation to generation, as do the memories of their lives and their deeds. From the shadows of Kilgore's proud and venerable past, they left behind silent echoes on streets too remarkable, too refined, and too rooted in a fabled land stained with their blood, their sweat, and their determination to ever be forgotten. Kilgore had defied the odds. It weathered the hard times. It survived the tough times. It held fast to the good times. And now we can hear their voices, long silenced, silenced no more. Voices from the past, their stories loud and clear. Voices from the boom, spoken by a proud generation, blessed with oil flowing beneath its feet and derricks rising above its head, that forged its way forward to build, as newspaper publisher Charles Duvall always said, the biggest little city in the world. Back then, Kilgore was far too familiar and far too comfortable to hold our interest. But as I look back down the long roads I've taken and glance back over the years that separated us, Kilgore and me, it just may have been the most intriguing place of all. Maybe Thomas Wolfe was right. Maybe we can't go home again. But then there's a good chance we take pieces of home with us wherever we go, however long it takes to get there. Kilgore was home then. Perhaps it always will be.
If you ever lived in Kilgore, you have heard of all her stories. You've rooted for her heroes through their sorrows and their glories. You've walked along her sidewalks, lost in tales of long ago, and gazed up through her derricks at a sky of stars aglow. If you've ever lived in Kilgore, you have heard about the boom. You've smelled perfume of pine trees and honeysuckle blooms. You've heard of old Dad Joyner, H.L. Hunt, and all the rest, and all the modern heroes who have made this town the best. If you've ever lived in Kilgore, though you wander far from here, you'll not forget your friendships and the folks you hold so dear. If you've ever lived in Kilgore, then you'll never be apart, because a part of Kilgore, a special part of Kilgore, will live